All right, so today in general anatomy and physiology, we have the red pencil tip again, and we're going through the reproductive anatomy. Okay, so here's the male reproductive anatomy. We're going to start looking down here at this model, this pelvic model. Okay, start with the testes, kind of work our way around. All right, so here we see the testicle located in the scrotum. Okay, so the scrotum is where it's found. This helps to reduce the temperature of the testes to 94 to 96 degrees, which helps to maintain sperm viability. Now, sperm are produced inside the testicle through a process called spermatogenesis. And as they're produced, they're going to enter into this structure here known as the epididymis. The epididymis here is a 20-foot long coiled tube where the sperm will travel when they're produced. They mature here, they're stored here, and they are reabsorbed here if they're not used within about 3 days. Now, this connection between the pelvic cavity and the testes is known as the spermatic cord. Okay, so this is the spermatic cord. In the spermatic cord, we see the testicular artery and vein. We also see the vas deferens, which starts here at the very tip of the epididymis and then works its way back up around into the pelvic cavity. Okay, so you see the vas deferens coming around here. And then the vas deferens is going to go and wrap around behind the bladder and attach to the ejaculatory duct. Now the ductus or vas deferens is capable of peristalsis, and so it pushes the sperm into the pelvic cavity during coitus, where they accumulate in the ejaculatory duct. Now, this gland right here is known as the seminal vesicle. Okay, so here's the seminal vesicle. This is a gland that helps produce fluid, which mixes with the sperm, creating semen. Now, the seminal vesicle produces about 2/3 of the semen, about 66%. And here we see the prostate just below the bladder. This is also connecting through the ejaculatory duct, and the prostate produces about 1/3 of the fluid of semen. And it also contains a few constituents like citrate and an enzyme called PSA, prostate-specific enzyme. Okay, so PSA, prostate-specific enzyme. Now, if we were to open this up, okay, so we're going to take this out. Open it up, we can see a little bit more of the anatomy. Here's the ejaculatory duct that we talked about. It connects through the prostate to the urethra. Okay, so here you can see the reproductive system. There's the detrusor muscle of the bladder. There's the transitional epithelium and rugae. And here's the urethra. Now the urethra is where the semen will accumulate during coitus. Okay, and then during the process of ejaculation, it will end up going down the urethra from the male then to the female. Now here you can see the penile structures. We see the shaft of the penis. We can see the suspensory ligament, which is right here. And then we can see the head of the penis or the glans penis. Now this right here is an example of a circumcised male. All right, the skin right here, known as the prepuce or foreskin, would go over the top of the head of the penis in an uncircumcised male. But here we can see the head is exposed. That extra skin has been trimmed away from the glands. Now, inside the penis, we see the erectile tissues, okay, making up the dorsal aspect of the penis, and the shaft is the corpus cavernosa. There's 2 of these. And then around the urethra, and then also making up the head of the penis here, is the corpus spongiosum. Okay, so just one of those. 2 of the cavernosa. Okay, so there you can see the urethra coming out and the urethral orifice there at the tip of the penis. Now, if we look at the next pelvic model, all right, so here's another pelvic model that we see. Now, here you can see a little bit different presentation. Okay, so here is the testes, okay, contained within the spermatic cord. Now, these red strips that we see around the spermatic cord, these are the cremaster muscle strips. Now, there's 2 muscles that help to regulate the temperature of the testes, keeping the testes around 94 to 96 degrees. And this is the cremaster muscle. So the cremaster muscle, okay, these strips of tissue here that we see around the spermatic cord, that's one of the muscles that helps to regulate temperature. The other muscle is called the dartos muscle, which is in the scrotum skin. Okay, so the dartos muscle is in the skin here. We cannot see it, but the dartos and the cremaster, which we do see here, help to regulate temperature. Okay, now on this side we can see the spermatic cord has been kind of cut away. We can see the testicle, we can see the epididymis, we can see the testicular artery and vein, and back here we can see the vas deferens, starting here at the tail of the epididymis, running up and then into the pelvic cavity. All right, so again, here's the vas deferens running around the back, attaching at the ejaculatory duct. This right here is going to be the seminal vesicles. There you can see the prostate. Now, when we look at the inside of this model, okay, so we can see again, we can see the urethra. We can see the ejaculatory duct here connecting to the urethra as it runs through the prostate. And then here you can see where the urethra goes through the urogenital diaphragm. This right here is the external urethral sphincter. And this right here is another little gland that we see in the male known as the Cowper's gland or bulbourethral gland. This produces a mucus which cleans the urethra prior to ejaculation, which prevents the urine from killing all of the sperm as they leave from the male to the female. Now we can see a little bit more here of the erectile tissues on this model. Again, here's the corpus cavernosa, and then the blue tissue here, this is the corpus spongiosum. Now this bulbous area, this is the bulb of the penis, okay? But again, all of this is going to be corpus spongiosum as it wraps around the urethra and then also forming the head of the penis or the glans penis. Okay, so again, this right here is the suspensory ligament of the penis, okay? On this side, okay, relatively the same. The one thing that is missing on this side of the model would be the Cowper's gland, okay? Now, we will be starting to look now at the female reproductive anatomy. Okay, so looking at the female reproductive anatomy, we're going to start with the ovary. Okay, so the ovary is located up here against the posterior pelvic wall. All right, so there's the ovary. The ovary helps to secrete estrogen and progesterone, and it also releases the oocytes. Now, holding the ovary in place, we have this ovarian ligament, which goes from the ovary to the uterus. We also see the broad ligament, which is this membrane which covers everything and is part of your peritoneum. Okay, so the broad ligament kind of covers it. The entire area here goes over the top of the entire area, and that is part of your peritoneum. Now, we have right here the ovarian artery and vein, which comes down to the ovary. And then surrounding the ovary, we see the oviduct or fallopian tube. Now, these finger-like structures, or these variegations right here, are the fimbria, which lie across the top of the ovary. They are ciliated, and this helps to draw in the ovulated egg to the oviduct. Now, where the fimbria attach to the main portion of the oviduct, this area is known as the infundibulum. So the egg is drawn into the infundibulum, and then it starts to work its way down through the oviduct. Now, the oviduct is the most common site of fertilization, and typically that happens up here at the opening, which we call the infundibulum. And then as it is fertilized, it goes down and then into the uterus. Now, if we were to take this out, we could see a little bit more inside the uterus. Okay, so the uterus is this kind of pear-shaped structure. It sits on top of the bladder. This kind of bulbous end is the fundus. The main portion is the body, and then the tip is the cervix. Now, the uterus has 3 layers of tissue. The outer layer here is the perimetrium. The middle layer here is the myometrium, which is a smooth muscle layer. The smooth muscle layer is what contracts during labor contractions to help deliver the baby. It also contracts when someone is having their menstrual cycle, the menses, and it helps to clean out the inside of the uterus during menses. Now, the lining of the uterus, this lining right here, is the endometrium. So the endometrium is the layer that will receive a fertilized ovum, allowing implantation and pregnancy to develop. It also is the layer that is sloughed off during menses due to a drop in the hormone progesterone and estrogen. Now, when we look at the cervix, we can see the cervical canal. The opening is called the os. So here's the external os. The internal opening is the internal os. Okay, those are a little minute to pin during a lab exam, but we do want to make sure we understand the openings are the os on either end of the cervical canal. Now, at the tip of the cervix here, we see the vagina, the vaginal canal or birth canal. Okay, so you see that originate here at the cervix and then extend outward to the external genitalia, which we refer to as the vulva. So the vulva is the area here that contains the external genitalia. Now, the area that goes from the pubic bone to the coccyx, okay, this entire area is known as the perineum. The perineum includes the vulva and the anus, the external anal orifice. Okay, so that entire area is the perineum. The area just here around the external genitalia, this is the vulva. Now, there's 4 structures here in the vulva or external genitalia. This fatty area right here, this is the mons pubis. Okay, typically we would see pubic hair along the external surface of the mons. Around the vaginal and urethral orifice, we see the external fold of tissue here known as the labia majora, the internal layer known as the labia minora, and then this structure right here at the tip of the minor, okay, so very tip of the minor, here we see the clitoris. Okay, so the clitoris is a very sensitive structure. It's the most sensitive structure in the female, comparing that to the glans penis of the male. Okay, so the glans penis is the most sensitive structure in the male reproductive anatomy, and that correlates with the clitoris that we see here in the female. Now, just like the erectile tissues that we see here, where we have the corpus cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum, okay, the clitoris and the labia minora are erectile tissues for the female. So when the female becomes aroused and during coitus, the clitoris enlarges and stiffens with venous blood, as well as the labia minora, okay? And so they become erect, just like the erectile tissues of the male. Now, holding the uterus in place, okay, so holding the uterus in place above the bladder, we have a few ligaments that we want to pay attention to here. The first of which is this one here, which goes from the uterus towards the front of the body. This right here is known as the round ligament of the uterus. And then behind the uterus, we see this fold of tissue here known as the uterosacral ligament. So uterosacral ligament goes from the uterus around back towards the sacrum. Okay, so those are relatively easy to see here in this pelvic model. Now, when we look at the next pelvic model, okay, so again, here we can see the ovary. Okay, so the ovary surrounded by the fimbria and the fallopian tube. Here's the ovarian ligament. Okay, there's the ovarian ligament. All right, so we see the uterus here. We see the fundus, the main portion. Now, from this view, we can see the round ligament, which extends from the uterus forward towards the front of the pelvis. Okay, so on either side, there's the round ligament. And then behind here, we can see the uterosacral ligament. So this fold of tissue right here is the uterosacral ligament going around the rectum and then towards the sacrum, which would be back in this area. Now, as we look at the mid-sagittal view, we can see the uterus. Okay, so again, perimetrium on the outside, myometrium on the inside, endometrium, the lining here. We can see the cervical canal, the cervix. We can see the vagina. We can see the urethra, okay, external urethral sphincter. We can see the clitoris here. We can see the mons pubis, labia minora, labia majora. Now we can also see parts of the digestive system. We can see the rectum, so here's the rectum, and then we see the anal canal, and then around here is the external anal sphincter. So if we were to look at that in a flipped view, okay, so again, here's the rectum, and then this muscle right here is going to be the external anal sphincter. All right, also with the male. Okay, so looking at the male, okay, there's the rectum, and then we see the external anal sphincter wrapping around the anus. So we do want to pay attention to those structures when we look at the pelvic models. All right. Now, when we look at the ovary a little bit more closely, okay, so we see inside the ovary where we find the follicles. Now, the follicles are the small containers which will hold the developing oocytes. Okay, so inside the ovary we see oogenesis, the production of the oocytes. And in that process we have these follicles, these little containers. Now up here we can see the ovarian artery and vein. Okay, this right here would be the ovarian ligament, which goes then towards the uterus. Now, the oocytes begin development at the end of gestation. So in the third trimester, the oocytes begin developing. Now, after they begin developing, they stop until they reach puberty. Okay, so at puberty, then the oocytes begin to progress down their developmental process. Now, when you're born, when a female is born, the oocytes are contained in very small follicles known as the primordial follicles. So these little guys are primordial follicles. Okay, so we see a bunch of them on either side of the ovary. And when puberty occurs, the hormones FSH and LH trigger follicular development, and they also trigger the development of the oocytes to progress, okay, to maturity. Now, when FSH and LH are produced, these little follicles begin to grow and mature. They become primary follicles. So here's a couple primary follicles. These primary follicles have one layer of cuboidal cells around the outside. And now we can see the oocyte on the inside. Now, these continue to grow into a secondary follicle where we have two layers of cuboidal cells. Now, these cuboidal cells begin to produce lots of estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen is the primary hormone that they produce early in the monthly cycle, okay? So this process is known as the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is a 28-day cycle where we see progression from primordial to primary to secondary. And as the secondary continues to grow under the influence of FSH, it reaches this large follicle here known as the Graafian follicle. Now, the Graafian is the end stage secondary follicle. Okay, so it's the end of the secondary follicular stage. We call it Graafian. It is full of fluid. Here we can see a secondary oocyte ready to be ovulated. So here we can see the process of ovulation taking place where the secondary oocyte, the Graafian follicle, is going to expel it. Okay, so here's the secondary oocyte. The Graafian is going to rupture under the influence of LH. So about day 14 of the ovarian cycle, we see a very high spike in LH, and that's what triggers the Graafian follicle to burst. And this is going to expel the secondary oocyte into the pelvic region. And again, this is where it's going to be collected by the fimbria. Okay, so these are ciliated, and it's going to draw in that little oocyte to the fallopian tube where it should be fertilized or could be fertilized. Now, once the Graafian follicle ruptures, it does not die or dissipate. It changes or transitions into this structure known as the corpus luteum. Luteum stands for yellow, so this is the yellow follicle. Now, the corpus luteum is going to produce lots and lots of progesterone, some estrogen, but primarily progesterone. Progesterone is what prepares the endometrium for implantation of a fertilized oocyte. Now, if fertilization and implantation do not occur, then the luteum will die or degenerate after 10 days and become one of these silvery white follicles known as the corpus albicans. Okay, so here's a corpus albicans, the albino or white follicle, and that's what's left at the end of the ovarian cycle. Okay? Now, the last structures to go through here would be the mammary glands. All right, so the mammary glands we can see here in the breast. Okay, now the mammary gland develops because of the influence of estrogen and progesterone, causes the mammary glands to grow and develop. Now the mammary gland itself is typically divided into 12 to 15 lobes. We can't quite see that on this model, we can just see the gland itself. Now each of the lobes that I just mentioned will have a duct which travels up towards the nipple. Okay, so here, right here, we can see these lactiferous ducts just below the nipple, and each duct would come from its own lobe of mammary gland. Now, the mammary glands or the breast is held up in place by a suspensory ligament, so there's suspensory ligaments throughout this area which hold the mammary glands and the breast in place over the top of the pectoralis major. Now the nipple is where these lactiferous ducts will open, and if someone chooses to breastfeed, okay, the lactiferous ducts, okay, and at the nipple that would be the exit of the breast milk. Now, when we look at the mammary gland here with the skin and the fat tissue still attached, okay, we can see the area around the nipple known as the areola. Now, the areola is a very important aspect of the mammary glands and the breast tissue itself. Now, in the areola, we see tactile receptors. There's little tactile receptors here. When stimulated, cause the nipple to become erect, opening up the ducts for the passage of milk. Now, stimulating the areola will also trigger the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is essential for this process to cause the release of milk here at the mammary glands. Now, the hormone that produces milk at the mammary gland is prolactin, but the hormone that triggers milk letdown or release at the mammary gland is going to be oxytocin. So it would behoove you to make sure you remember all of those different hormones that act here at the mammary glands. That should be all of the anatomy that you guys are required to know, and hopefully this will help you prepare for the exam.